He was standing at the side of the stage. Not performing, not rehearsing, just standing there, holding a glass he had not touched in 20 minutes. The room was full. The lights were hot, and every person in that room was watching the man at center stage. Not him. Dean Martin had been in rooms like this his entire life. Smoke and laughter and the sound of applause meant for someone else. He knew how to carry that. He had made a career out of making it look easy. But that night was different, because the man on that stage had just said something that could not be taken back. Something wrapped in a smile, delivered like a compliment, but Dean had heard it for exactly what it was: a dare. And the question now, the question no one in that room could answer, was whether Dean Martin was going to walk away, or whether he was about to do the one thing nobody expected. This is not a story about two men and a song. This is a story about what happens when one man looks at another and says, "I do not think you have it in you." And the other man has to decide, in front of everyone, who he really is. It was 1962. Las Vegas was not yet the version of itself that would become a postcard. It was rawer than that, louder. The neon was newer, and it burned a little desperate. The casinos ran all night, because there was no reason to stop. The lounges were packed every weekend with people who had come from somewhere quieter and wanted, just for a few days, to feel like something was happening. Dean Martin understood that feeling. He had built his entire public life around it. By 62, Dean was everywhere. The Rat Pack had taken over popular culture in a way that felt effortless, which was the whole point. The sands, the recordings, the films. Dean was the one who seemed like he was barely trying, and people loved him for it. He was the guy who walked out with a drink in his hand and made you feel like the night had just gotten better. But underneath that, there was something else. You know that feeling when you have been somewhere so long that people stop seeing you. When the room knows your name but not your weight. When you could stand in the center of everything and still feel like you are being looked through. Dean had that. Not always, but more than he ever said. He had grown up Joseph Paul Dino Crossetti in Steubenville, Ohio, the son of a barber. He had dropped out of school at 16, worked in a steel mill, ran numbers for a local bookmaker, boxed a little. Not a story that fit neatly with the image. He had sanded the edges off it over the years, replaced the rough parts with a shrug and a joke and another song. But the rough parts were still there. Elvis Presley was 27 that year. He had come back from the army in 60, 2 years away, and he had returned to a country that had changed faster than anyone expected. The edges of his early sound, the ones that had made adults genuinely nervous in 56, had softened. The movies had come in. The ballads. Elvis was still the biggest name in the room, any room. But some of the danger had drained out. What had naughty drained out was his faith. That part of Elvis Presley was not a performance. It was not management strategy or public relations. Elvis had grown up in the Assembly of God Church in Tupelo, Mississippi. Gospel music was not a genre to him. It was the first music he had ever loved. The first music that had ever made him feel like there was something larger than the room he was standing in. He had recorded gospel throughout his career. He would win 3 Grammy Awards in his life. Every one of them for gospel recordings. People sometimes forgot that. Dean Martin did not forget. Here is what nobody ever talks about. The two men were not close. They were cordial. They occupied the same professional universe. They appeared at the same events, moved through the same circles, smiled in the same photographs. But Dean and Elvis had almost nothing in common beneath the surface. Dean was Catholic in the way of men who had grown up Catholic and then grown up, meaning the church lived somewhere in the back of his chest, quiet and unvisited. Elvis carried his faith forward. Out front, he did not apologize for it. And that difference mattered. It mattered because Dean had a way of testing people. Not loud, not cruel, subtle. The kind of test that came wrapped in a compliment or a joke, so that if you called him on it, you were the one who seemed small. The people around him knew that about him. Most of them let it pass. Elvis had not let it pass before. Not publicly, but there had been moments in the years leading up to that night where Elvis had heard the edge in something Dean said and had gone still in a way that other people in the room noticed, even if they said nothing afterward. Why would Dean push on something like this? Why would a man take a run at another man's faith, of all things, in a room full of people who were there to have a good time? The answer was not simple. There were people in Dean's world who thought the gospel thing was an act. Not Elvis specifically, but the whole genre of men who got on stage and invoked the name of God and wept and trembled and then went back to their hotel rooms and did exactly what they wanted. Dean had seen enough of that to develop a healthy suspicion. Maybe more than healthy. Maybe had calcified into something harder. Or maybe Dean was testing something he genuinely wanted to know. Was it real? Was any of it real? 3 people saw what happened before the dare. None of them talked about it publicly for years. One account surfaced in a biography written long after both men were gone. Another came from a musician who was backstage that night and gave one interview, late in his life, to a small publication that almost nobody read. The third came from a woman who worked at the venue, who told her daughter, who eventually told a journalist who had the sense to write it down. The details they each remembered were different, but on one thing, all 3 agreed. Dean had been drinking, but he was not drunk. That part mattered. What he said next was not something that slipped out. He had chosen it. The room was a back lounge area, adjacent to the main performance space at the Sands. The kind of place where performers cycled through before and after sets. There were maybe 25 people. Not a crowd. Just the usual mix of musicians, handlers, a few hangers on who had made it past the right doors. Elvis had been talking about a recording session. He had been working on something he wanted to include on a gospel album he was planning. His voice had changed when he talked about it, the way it always changed when the subject turned to that music. The performance quality dropped out. What was left was something quieter and more direct. Dean had listened. Then he had said, with the full weight of that easy smile, "You know what would make a hell of a moment? You actually singing that live. Tonight. Up there. See if it lands the same way when there is no studio around it." But he let that sit for exactly 1 second. Then he said, "Or does it only work when nobody is watching?" The room went still. Not completely. People kept moving. Glasses kept clinking somewhere nearby. But the small circle of people who had heard it, they went still. Elvis looked at Dean. Not angry. That was the thing the witnesses remembered. Elvis Presley did not look angry. He looked like a man who had just been handed something and was deciding, very carefully, whether to pick it up. Most men would have laughed it off. Most men would have made a joke back, reset the energy in the room, moved on. That was the socially acceptable move. That was what men in that world did when they did not want to show that something had landed. But Elvis was now most men, and what he did next was not what Dean had expected. He set down his drink. He straightened up, and he said, very quietly, "All right, just that. One word. No performance in it." All right. The question now. The question Dean Martin had not fully through before he opened his mouth was what exactly he had just set in motion. If you have ever watched someone agree to something that should have stayed hypothetical, you know what that room felt like. There is a moment where the joke becomes real and nobody knows how to stop it. Where the challenge that was only supposed to create a brief tension suddenly has weight and direction and a next step. Dean had dared Elvis to sing gospel live, in a casino lounge, in front of people who had come for cocktails and a show. Elvis had said yes. If stories like this are the kind that stay with you, subscribe. We find the moments that history almost forgot. The ones that did not make the official record, but never fully disappeared. The next part of this story is the part nobody talks about. What happened when Elvis actually walked to that stage? What Dean did when he realized what he had started. Stay with it. The main room was not expecting anything unusual. The regular show had run its course. The band was in a loose end of night mode, playing background music for a room that was slowly redistributing itself between the bar and the exits. The MC had already wrapped. The lights were at their late night level, lower, warmer, the kind of lighting designed to make everyone look slightly better than they were. Elvis came in from the side. No announcement, no introduction. He walked to the piano player first and leaned down and said something in his ear. The piano player nodded. Elvis stood up and walked to the microphone, and the room started to figure out that something was happening before anyone said a word. He did not introduce the song. He did not explain himself. He just started. What came out was Peace in the Valley. Thomas A. Dorsey had written it in 1939. Red Foley had recorded it. Elvis had recorded his own version back in '57, and it had been one of the best things he ever put on tape. But this was not the studio version. This was Elvis Presley standing in a casino lounge at midnight in Las Vegas with no arrangement, no production, no safety net, and singing the way he had learned to sing before anyone was paying attention. The room changed. You know that moment when sound does something to a room that talking cannot do. When the vibration of a voice hits something that has nothing to do with the words. The bartenders slowed down. The people heading for the exit stopped. Not because they recognized the song. Most of them probably did not. But because something in the room had shifted, and the body knows that shift before the mind catches up. Dean Martin was standing at the back. He had come in after Elvis. He had not expected this. He had expected Elvis to fumble with it, to stand up there and do a competent version of something, and then sit back down, and the whole thing would be over. And Dean would have gotten what he had actually wanted, which was confirmation that the faith thing was performance. A beautiful performance, maybe. But performance. He had not expected this. He had not expected Elvis to close his eyes after the first verse. He had not expected the room to go that quiet. Here is what nobody talks about. Dean Martin had seen everything. He had been in show business since the early 40s. He had worked rooms that were hostile and rooms were indifferent and rooms that were full of people who would cheer for anything. He knew the difference between an audience that was politely enjoying something and an audience that had been reached. This room had been reached, and Dean was watching it happen from 15 feet away. The song is about a valley where there is no sadness and no pain, where the lamb and the lion lie down together, where the darkness is done. It is a song about the world being fixed, about the broken thing being repaired. It is a song that only works if the person singing it believes it, even slightly, even for the duration of the song. Because the moment the voice disconnects from the content, the listener feels it. Immediately, without knowing why. Elvis had not disconnected. By the second verse, a woman near the front was crying, not making a scene of it. Just sitting there with tears moving down her face, like she had not decided to cry and could not stop it now that it had started. The piano player was barely touching the keys. Elvis finished. The room held the silence for a second longer than silence usually gets held in a casino lounge. And then the applause came. Not the loud, performative kind, but the kind that comes from people who were not sure they were allowed to make noise, but could not stay quiet. Elvis stepped back from the microphone. He looked at Dean. Just for a moment. He did not smile. He did not say anything. He just looked. And Dean Martin, who had a response for everything, who had built an entire career on the perfectly timed word and the easy deflection, stood there at the back of that room. And he did not say a word. He looked at the floor. Then he looked back up. And the witnesses, who were close enough, said that something had moved across his face that they had never seen there before. Not embarrassment. Not quite. Something more like being caught. But that was not the end. What Dean Martin did with that silence, in the hours after, and in the months after, and in the years that followed, that was a different story. And it started, of all places, with a phone call that nobody expected him to make. Stay with it. The next morning the Sands was the same as it always was in the morning. Cleaning staff moving through the quiet rooms. The smell of the night before. The specific silence of a place that had been loud for hours and had not yet become loud again. Dean was awake early. That alone was unusual. He was not a morning person by habit or by choice. The hours he kept were the hours of a man who trusted the night more than the day. But he had not slept much. He had gone to his room after the lounge, poured a drink he did not finish, and sat with something that had no comfortable name. He made the call before noon. He asked to speak to Elvis. The people around Elvis were surprised. Dean Martin calling in the morning was not a regular occurrence. They put him through. The conversation was short. What was said in it was never fully confirmed. One account has Dean saying simply, "That was something." Another has him going slightly further, saying something about the fact that he had not expected it, and that he owed Elvis that acknowledgement. Elvis, by this account, had said something back that was characteristically simple. He had said, "I know." Not as a rebuke, not as a point scored, just as a man acknowledging that another man had been honest with him, and that honesty was enough. The people around both of them noticed something in the weeks that followed. Dean had started, quietly, to talk differently about gospel music, not effusively, not in the converted man way. Dean was not built for that kind of reversal, but the dismissal had gone out of it. The edge, the thing in his voice that had always slightly curled when the subject came up, he had stopped testing it. There is something that happens when a man sees something real happen in front of him and has no way to explain it away. He does not always change. He does not always convert or shift or publicly acknowledge what he witnessed. But something adjusts. Some small internal accounting gets updated. Dean had known his whole life that there were things he did not have access to. Things that required a kind of openness he had never fully managed to build. The faith of his childhood had been a set of rules and a building and a priest. It had not been what he had seen in that lounge. What he had seen in that lounge was a man whose relationship to something bigger than himself was so genuine and so deep that it could silence a room in Las Vegas at midnight with a song from 1939. Here is what nobody talks about. That is a rare thing. That kind of genuineness is not a skill. You cannot practice it into existence. You either have it or you do not. And the people around you know the difference, even if they cannot say exactly what the difference is. Dean had spent a career being the most effortlessly present person in any room. But effortless presence and genuine depth are not the same thing. He had always known that about himself. He had not always been comfortable with the knowing. In the months that followed, something changed between the two men. Not dramatically. They were never close in the way that requires constant contact. But the cordiality between them had a different quality. The performance of it had relaxed into something that felt more actual. They were photographed together twice, that year at industry events. In one of the photographs, Dean has a hand on Elvis's shoulder, and he is looking at something off camera. Elvis is looking at Dean, and there is something in Elvis's expression that reads, "If you look at it long enough," like a man who has decided to trust somebody and is comfortable with that decision. It is a small thing, but small things are where the real history usually lies. The years went on. Dean Martin's career would peak and shift, and find its later form in the television specials and the continued recordings. He would lose his son in a plane crash in 1987, and the loss would reach something in him that nothing else had ever reached. People who knew him said he never fully returned from that. He became quieter. He pulled back. The performance of ease that had been his public identity for 40 years finally ran out of fuel. He still drank. He still listened to music. There are accounts of him, in his later years, listening to gospel records alone in his house in Beverly Hills. Not any specific record that got reported. Just the genre. Just that music. Whether the night at the Sands had anything to do with that, nobody can say for certain, but people who were there that night remembered it. And the ones who remembered it always said the same thing. They said Dean Martin's face, in that moment when Elvis finished singing, was the realest thing they ever saw from him. Not a role. Not a bit. Just a man realizing he had been wrong about something. Elvis Presley died in August of 1977. He was 42. Dean was 60 that year. He did not speak publicly about Elvis' death in any extended way. There was a statement, brief, formal, the kind of thing that gets drafted by a publicist and signed off on. But the people close to Dean said that he took the news differently than they expected. That he sat with it for a while. He never explained himself. That was who he was. What had happened between them? The dare, the song, the phone call. The adjustments that nobody announced, but everyone felt. It never got a formal chapter in either man's public story. It was the kind of thing that lives in the gaps. In the secondary accounts, in the memory of a piano player who gave one interview late in his life and said, "I was there. I saw what it did to him." He was never quite the same about certain things after that. But it never happened officially. And now it never will. Think about someone in your life who carried their belief quietly. Not as a performance. Not as a weapon. Not as a way to make themselves larger in a room. Just quietly. The way you carry something that belongs to you, and you are not looking for anyone's approval about it. And think about whether you ever tested that person. Not cruelly. Maybe not even consciously. But with a question that had a slight edge to it. A tone that said, "I am not sure I believe you are what you say you are." and think about what happened. If you were lucky, that person did exactly what Elvis did. They did not argue. They did not explain. They just showed you. And if you were honest with yourself afterward, the way Dean was honest, in his quiet, private, undramatic way, you had to admit what you had seen. This is not a story about gospel music. This is not a story about Las Vegas or the 1960s or two famous men in the same room. This is a story about the difference between performance and truth. Dean Martin built his life on performance. Not deceptively. He was not a fraud. But the ease was constructed. The drink was a prop, famously, as often as it was a real drink. The careless charm was a product of enormous and ongoing effort. Dean knew how to make the room feel a certain way, and he executed that knowledge every night for 40 years. Elvis had that too. But Elvis also had something underneath it. Something that was not constructed. Something that had been there before the performances started and would be there after they ended. Faith is not about intention. A man can intend to believe and not manage it. A man can intend to be moved and stay dry. The intention is not the thing. The thing is the thing. Meaning no harm and doing no harm are not the same thing. And performing depth and having depth are not the same thing either. Dean knew that. He had always known it. That night in that lounge was just the night it became undeniable. The people we lose are rarely lost in a single moment. Sometimes we find them the same way. A lounge at the Sands Hotel. Midnight, 1962. A dare that was meant to expose something and ended up exposing the person who made it. A single song. A room that went quiet in a way that Las Vegas rooms almost never went quiet. A man at the back who had been certain of something and was no longer certain. Dean Martin never explained himself. He never gave an interview where he talked about that night. He never wrote about it. He never told the story the way the piano player eventually told it, quietly to a journalist who almost missed it. He just adjusted, in the small, private ways that matter more than the public ones. If stories like this are what you come here for, subscribe. The playlist is waiting. These are the stories that matter. The ones that happened in the gaps between the official record. The ones where you get a glimpse of who somebody actually was, behind the version of themselves they showed the world. That was Dean Martin. And that was the one night that never really ended. He stood at the back of a room in Las Vegas and watched a man sing a 70-year-old gospel song with nothing but a piano and the belief that the words were true. He watched it silence a room that had been paid to stay awake. He watched a woman cry who had not planned to cry. He felt something move through the space that he did not have a name for and did not try to name. And then he went back to his room, and something in him was different. Not loudly, not in a way that made the papers, not in a way that changed anything anyone could see, but different. Dean Martin had a glass in his hand most of his life, a joke ready, a way of making every room feel like the most comfortable place in the world. But he had seen, just once, what a room looked like when comfort was not the point. When the point was something else entirely. That was Dean Martin. That was the one night that never really ended.